In 1901, one of the most powerful zoologists in the United States, C. Hart Merriam, signed a document just 2 pages long. It was remarkably short, but nearly every line was a call to action, laying out specific instructions for how to destroy an animal that weighed less than 4.5 pounds. People immediately joined the campaign. Day and night, men with guns could be seen waiting in ambush beside prairie dog colonies and setting traps around burrow entrances. But that was not even the most brutal part. People were also paid to haul 68 tons of grain laced with strychnine onto the prairie. Teams on horseback moved slowly from one mound and burrow entrance to the next, scattering the poison deep into the ground. Once strychnine entered the bloodstream, it subjected its victims to agonizing convulsions before death. But the goal was total extermination. Exactly 1 week later, they returned to poison whatever animals had survived. Just 30 years later, one of the largest animal extermination campaigns in 20th century America had wiped out more than 5 billion prairie dogs. But why were people so determined to destroy them? And even more disturbing, although the campaign had succeeded, it was the surveys and reports that came afterward that would truly horrify scientists. Don't let the name fool you. Prairie dogs aren't dogs at all, they're rodents in the same family as squirrels. They are native to North America and once lived in enormous numbers across the continent. Where you see one prairie dog, there are usually many more nearby. They are true ecosystem engineers, helping sustain life across the entire prairie. Unfortunately, people only began to understand just how important they were after far too many of them had already disappeared. In the second half of the 19th century, as farming and ranching rapidly expanded across the Great Plains, this small animal was branded public enemy number 1. Prairie dogs were accused of stealing grass from livestock, digging burrows that could break cattle legs, and damaging crops. Then C. Hart Merriam presented numbers that sounded alarming. 32 prairie dogs supposedly consumed as much grass as 1 sheep, while 256 consumed as much as 1 cow, reducing rangeland productivity by as much as 75%. Those claims made people furious. As you saw at the beginning, they used some of the cruelest methods imaginable in an effort to completely eradicate prairie dogs. Authorities placed complete trust in Merriam and made prairie dog extermination mandatory. If 10 neighbors signed a petition, officials could enter a landowner's property and spread poison to kill the animals, even if the owner did not agree. The cost would then be added to the landowner's taxes. Prairie dogs once ranged from Canada, across the Great Plains, all the way into northern Mexico. But their extermination became a campaign on an unprecedented scale. By 1921, it had spread across 16 states, involving more than 104,000 farmers and livestock owners and using 1,235 tons of poison grain. In the end, Montana alone lost an estimated 9 million prairie dogs, while their range across the United States shrank by as much as 99%. This was one of the worst things people could have done. Even if prairie dog numbers later recovered, the ecosystem would never fully return to what it once was. A review by the U.S. Forest Service found that in parts of Montana, prairie dog colonies supported around 40% of the vertebrate fauna found in prairie habitats. And the first victims of their disappearance quickly began to emerge. Burrowing owls lost their shelter. Mountain plovers lost the open ground they needed for nesting. Eagles, hawks, coyotes, and badgers lost an important source of prey. But even this was only the beginning, because one especially important species nearly disappeared as prairie dogs vanished, the black-footed ferret. Almost its entire life is tied to prairie dogs. Around 90% of its diet consists of prairie dogs, while their burrows provide places for ferrets to sleep, hide from predators, give birth, and raise their young. A single ferret can eat around 100 prairie dogs a year. In many ways, the two species live together and die together. By 1967, the black-footed ferret had been listed as endangered, but it could not be allowed to disappear. And this was only one small example of what prairie dogs contributed to the ecosystem. Yet it was already enough to show scientists what an ecological disaster looked like. A solution that had once seemed successful had instead created a whole series of new problems that would leave people struggling to understand and solve them for generations. But the first real turning point did not begin with prairie dogs. It began with a black-footed ferret that everyone thought had already disappeared. In the fall of 1981, near Meeteetse, Wyoming, a ranch dog named Shep unexpectedly brought home the body of a strange animal. The family was about to throw it away until a taxidermist recognized it as a black-footed ferret. Biologists immediately rushed to the prairie dog colonies around the area and discovered that a surviving population was still there. By 1984, the black-footed ferret population had grown to around 130 animals, but that hope quickly collapsed. Sylvatic plague swept through prairie dog colonies, while canine distemper struck the ferrets. In the end, only 18 animals were brought into captivity. But successful captive breeding was still not enough. Where could they release the ferrets if the prairie dogs were gone? Without prey and without burrows, black-footed ferrets could not survive. To save the black-footed ferret, they were forced to save the prairie dog as well. In 1999, at the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge in Montana, biologist Randy Matchett, along with Joanne Dullum and Carrie Forsman, began doing something almost completely opposite to what people had done a century earlier, bringing prairie dogs back to areas where they had disappeared. But this was not as simple as catching a few animals, opening a cage, and letting them go. Prairie dogs live in closely bonded family groups, so the researchers tried to keep members of the same coterie together throughout capture and transport. At each release site, they cut the vegetation low so the small animals could better watch for predators, then drilled about 30 artificial burrows, each roughly 2 feet deep, giving them immediate shelter as they entered a completely unfamiliar landscape. Each animal was also treated for fleas to reduce the risk of plague, fitted with ear tags for monitoring, and grouped according to the ratio of males, females, and juveniles to create a population capable of reproducing. Some sites received 60 prairie dogs, while others received 120. The results surprised the scientists. 5 of the 6 release sites succeeded. After just 1 year, the area covered by the experimental colonies had increased by about 315%, and after 4 years, by roughly 924%. As the new colonies began to expand, the ecological effects we have not yet talked about gradually became more visible. A landscape that had once fallen silent began to show new mounds again, gradually warning calls and burrow entrances that were constantly being enlarged. As the new colonies continued to spread, another role of prairie dogs also became increasingly clear. They do not simply live on the prairie, they are constantly rebuilding the very ground beneath their feet. A black-tailed prairie dog colony can have around 30 to 50 burrow entrances per acre. Burrow systems surveyed in Montana range from about 13 feet to more than 108 feet long and could reach depths of more than 13 feet. Each burrow system can disturb around 440 to 500 pounds of soil. One classic estimate found that just 12 burrows brought about 4 tons of soil from below ground to the surface across roughly 1 acre. And these were not just meaningless piles of dirt. Their digging loosens the soil, reduces compaction, carries organic matter deeper underground, and brings minerals from lower soil layers up toward the surface. Modern studies have also found that the mounds around burrow entrances become nutrient hotspots, with faster water infiltration in some soil types and higher levels of organic carbon at depths of about 4 to 12 inches. Above ground, the effects are even easier to see. One USGS study surveyed as many as 279 colonies across 13 complexes and 5 ecoregions and found that prairie dogs consistently reduced vegetation biomass. Black-tailed prairie dogs in the northern mixed prairie, in particular, reduce tall grasses and shrubs while increasing bare ground and forbs. Put simply, every day they graze, dig, move soil, and keep the prairie in a constant state of renewal. And only then did scientists begin to understand that what people had once dismissed as burrows that ruined the land were actually the visible traces of a non-stop prairie restoration machine. Prairie dogs were returning, and black-footed ferrets finally had a chance to recover. But scientists quickly realized they still had not won. Another enemy was quietly lurking beneath the prairie: sylvatic plague, a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread mainly by fleas. For prairie dogs, a single outbreak can wipe out nearly an entire colony. For black-footed ferrets, losing prairie dogs means losing both food and shelter. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognizes plague as one of the biggest obstacles to ferret recovery. At UL Bend National Wildlife Refuge in Montana, the consequences became so clear that it almost looked like a natural experiment. In the fall of 2017, at least 24 black-footed ferrets still lived there. Then plague swept through the prairie dog colonies and wiped out about 67% of their habitat. Just 1 year later, in the fall of 2018, scientists could find only 2 adult ferrets. By the fall of 2019, that number had fallen to 0. A population that had been maintained for years had disappeared completely. This time, it was no longer a hypothesis. Prairie dogs collapsed, and ferrets collapsed right behind them. So Randy Matchett and his colleagues had to shift to an entirely different kind of battle. Not killing prairie dogs, but keeping them alive. At first, teams went from burrow to burrow, applying delta-methrin dust to kill the fleas that spread plague. Research in Montana showed that flea control could improve survival among unvaccinated ferrets, but the method was labor-intensive, expensive, and had to be repeated across vast areas. Then came a solution that sounded almost completely opposite to what had happened in the past. Peanut butter-flavored vaccine bait for prairie dogs. Each bait weighed only about 1 gram and was distributed in a grid at roughly 50 baits per acre, spaced about 30 feet apart so that one animal would not eat the entire colony's supply. At UL Bend, researchers tested a vaccine distribution system across about 1,200 acres of prairie dog habitat. Instead of having people walk every acre, they tested equipment mounted on ATVs and even multi-rotor drones. In 2017, those 1,200 acres were treated again, along with another roughly 300 acres at the Hawley complex. In the 1930s, people rode horses across the prairie spreading poisoned oats to kill prairie dogs. 8 decades later, drones were flying over those same grasslands, dropping vaccine bait in an effort to save them. But science delivered another painful lesson. A study conducted from 2013 to 2017, involving more than 2,200 marked prairie dogs and over 7,000 recaptures, found that the oral vaccine alone still did not protect prairie dogs well enough against plague. After repeated reintroduction failures caused by plague, scientists realized that simply breeding more black-footed ferrets and releasing them was not enough. The real problem lay beneath their feet. If prairie dog towns were too small, too isolated, or repeatedly collapsed because of disease, ferrets would quickly lose both their food and their shelter. So recovery efforts began shifting toward larger landscapes such as the Fort Belknap and Northern Cheyenne reservations, where tribal authorities, state agencies, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could manage an entire network of colonies rather than a series of small, isolated sites. The work there was far more complicated than simply putting animals back. Healthy colonies had to be protected from poisoning and shooting. Areas threatened by plague had to be treated for fleas. Places where prairie dogs had disappeared needed new groups to be translocated in, while keeping family units together whenever possible so they could quickly rebuild their burrow systems and social structure. Managers also had to track whether colonies continued expanding over multiple seasons, whether neighboring colonies were close enough to remain connected, and most importantly, whether there were enough prairie dogs to support a predator population over the long term, or only enough to keep a few ferrets alive temporarily. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation once had thousands of acres of prairie dog habitat, enough to attempt bringing ferrets back. But when plague dramatically reduced that landscape, the program was forced to return to the first step: rebuild the prey base first, then bring back the predator. From that point on, Montana began looking at recovery on a landscape scale. A few hundred acres of scattered colonies were not enough. To sustain even a few dozen adult black-footed ferrets, thousands of acres of connected prairie dog habitat would be needed, along with long-term management. Even as prairie dog colonies began to return, the story still did not have a simple happy ending. For many ranchers in Montana, prairie dogs remained a very real problem. They continued eating the same grasses used by cattle, expanding their colonies into grazing areas, digging thousands of additional burrow entrances, and sometimes spreading onto land that ranchers wanted to reserve entirely for livestock. So even though scientists call them a keystone species or ecosystem engineers, that does not mean the people who live and work directly on the grasslands immediately change their views. One side sees habitat, biodiversity, and an opportunity to restore black-footed ferrets. The other sees shared forage and higher land management costs. The conflict is no longer simply about killing or protecting prairie dogs. It has become a much harder question: how much of the prairie should be devoted to agricultural production, and how much should remain for the natural ecosystem? That is why Montana began testing a completely different approach. Instead of forcing landowners to accept losses in the name of conservation, the government began paying them to participate in conservation efforts. In July 2024, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks established a 10-year conservation agreement covering nearly 3,000 acres of prairie dog habitat in Garfield and Rosebud counties. The landowners received a one-time payment of about $148,750, equivalent to $50 for every protected acre. In return, prairie dogs within the agreement area cannot be shot or poisoned, the land cannot be plowed or converted in ways that destroy the habitat, and plague will be actively managed. Importantly, livestock grazing is still allowed to continue. In other words, the goal is not to push ranching out of the landscape, but to find a way for cattle and prairie dogs to coexist on the same land. If conditions are right, the area could even become a future reintroduction site for black-footed ferrets. And it did not stop with Montana beginning to pay people to protect them. Across many parts of the Great Plains, colonies that were once seen as something to eliminate have now become places where visitors stop with cameras and binoculars to watch wildlife. In Montana itself, Graycliff Prairie Dogtown State Park sets aside 98 acres to protect a community of black-tailed prairie dogs. Montana FWP promotes the site for wildlife viewing, photography, and education, even describing it as one of the most convenient places to observe a prairie dog town. At Devil's Tower National Monument, a colony covering only about 40 acres is home to more than 600 prairie dogs living right beside the park road. The NPS has turned the area into an official wildlife viewing stop, with parking, photo opportunities, and hiking trails that pass alongside the colony. Visitors do not just see prairie dogs. Foxes, badgers, eagles, deer, and many birds of prey are also commonly seen around the town. In 2024, Devil's Tower welcomed more than 540,000 visitors. They spent about $41.7 million in nearby communities, supported roughly 407 jobs, and generated more than $52 million in economic output. Of course, no one can say that 600 prairie dogs created all of that money, but they have become an official part of the experience the park offers its visitors. The scale is even more obvious at Badlands National Park. The NPS actively directs visitors to Roberts Prairie Dog Town, described as the largest prairie dog town in the park's easily accessible areas. The agency also notes that habitat created by prairie dogs is associated with around 200 species of plants and animals. In 2024, Badlands welcomed about 1.09 million visitors, generating $143.2 million in visitor spending, supporting roughly 1,410 jobs, and contributing more than $191 million in economic output to the region. At Wind Cave, the NPS even encourages visitors to seek out prairie dog towns because they are some of the best places to see badgers, coyotes, birds of prey, bison, and pronghorn all in the same area. The park welcomed nearly 489,400 visitors in 2024, with about $48.6 million spent by visitors in surrounding communities. And at Theodore Roosevelt National Park, roads pass directly through 3 large prairie dog towns. The NPS actively promotes driving through them as a way to look for predators and grazing animals. In 2024, the park welcomed more than 732,000 visitors, generating nearly $55.8 million in visitor spending. Looking vision show it happened after prairie dogs disappeared, Montana gradually became part of a much larger warning about burrowing animals around the world. What scientists discovered was not simply that, if one species disappears, the grass dies with it. Something more important was happening. When prairie dogs vanished, the structure of the entire prairie shifted into a different state. A major USGS study surveyed 279 colonies across 13 complexes and 5 ecoregions and found that prairie dogs consistently reduced vegetation height and biomass, limited shrubs, and created more bare ground and forbs. That constant disturbance produced a type of grassland very different from areas without prairie dogs. Soil studies have also found that mounds around burrows can contain more nutrients and organic carbon, have lower soil compaction, and, in some landscapes, allow water to infiltrate faster than undisturbed ground. And this phenomenon is not limited to North America. In the highlands of Kenya, Researchers found that underground mole rats are associated with enormous mounds, reaching up to 6.5 feet high and about 65 feet across. Burrowing activity carried out over many generations may move enough soil to alter the shape of the landscape itself. Later research on African mole rats in South Africa also found that the soils they disturbed were less compacted, richer in nutrients, and supported different plant communities, confirming that animals that are almost never seen above ground can still function as true ecosystem engineers. In Patagonia, Argentina, tucos revealed that same power through even more remarkable numbers. In one study of Ctenomys hagei, scientists recorded an average of more than 1,000 new soil mounds per hectare. Together, they covered about 18% of the ground surface and brought roughly 120 cubic meters of soil per hectare to the surface. The freshly excavated soil was nearly 10 times less compacted than the surrounding ground, creating very different microsites for plant roots and vegetation recovery. From the Great Plains to Kenya, Patagonia, and Kazakhstan, the same pattern keeps appearing. Small animals digging every day are quietly moving tons of soil, opening pathways for water, redistributing nutrients, and creating new patches of habitat. They do not control entire ecosystems on their own. But when these underground engineers disappear, the landscapes they helped build over thousands of years begin to change with them. In the end, prairie dogs are not perfect heroes. They really can compete with livestock for food and reduce vegetation biomass in some areas. But they also dig burrows, reshape soil and vegetation, create habitat, and support an entire network of wildlife. The biggest historical mistake was not that people tried to control them. It was believing that a species could be nearly erased from the landscape while everything else continued functioning normally. So if a species can cause economic damage while also helping hold an entire food web together, how far should we go to protect it?